to a 2/3 reduction in sales, destroying 8 straight years of profits and causing a sound business to operate at a loss. The pandemic had a greater impact than the Great Recession of 2008, demonstrating a clear economic impact. During the pandemic, Fitzpatrick applied for a hearing for an exemption from COVID-19 regulations but was immediately denied. The government set up these hearings to allow corporations an exemption, allowing a completely unnecessary film crew to operate in Buckeye. This knocks down the third pillar of this case. The character of the government's actions were inconsistent, rash, and discriminatory towards restaurants, eventually leading to Fitzpatrick's closing on December 12, 2020. In this case, the court should grant Fitzpatrick's writ of mandamus, as this case falls under the 3 pillars required in Penn Central v. New York. To prove this, we will be calling Hollis Fitzpatrick and Finley Ibarra to demonstrate how the government's actions had an unfair economic impact, interfered with investment-backed expectations, and showcased the rashness of the government's actions. The government ended the American dream for a family, and the justice system must rectify this mistake. With this in mind, the realtor respectfully requests that the court awards Fitzpatrick with just compensation in order to protect Fitzpatrick's rights.
Thank you. Do the respondents have an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court, not a government taking, just poor decision-making, is a phrase that encapsulates the situation of the relator, Hollis Fitzpatrick. Governor DeBeer and the Buckeye Health Department combated the spread of the COVID-19 virus through temporary business shutdowns and by issuing pandemic restrictions, with public health always in mind. Unfortunately, Fitzpatrick's restaurant closed in the midst of the pandemic, resulting from Fitzpatrick's poor decision-making. The issue here today is whether or not the government's pandemic restrictions amount to a partial regulatory taking of private property, Fitzpatrick's, for public use. We intend to prove that this is simply not the case. To determine this, the court must consider 3 factors from Penn Central Transportation Company versus the City of New York. 1, the economic impact of the regulation on the claimant. 2, the extent to which the regulation has interfered with distinct investment-backed expectations. And 3, the character of the governmental action. Today you will hear evidence that all of these aspects weigh in the respondent's favor. First, you will hear that the economic impact of the restrictions was not severe enough to constitute a taking. Prior to the pandemic, Fitzpatrick's was far from being labeled a financial success. You will learn that Fitzpatrick's filed for bankruptcy in 2010. Additionally, you will hear from Aspen Bennett, a former employee of Fitzpatrick's, about the multiple instances where...
Sorry, you appear to have been frozen. Respondents, can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor.
You froze maybe 30 seconds ago.
Oh, okay. Can you remember anything that I said recently?
I don't. I don't remember what the last thing I said was. Just back up 2 or 3 sentences, and we'll give you some extra time if you go over the repetition.
Thank you, Your Honor. You will learn that Fitzpatrick's filed for bankruptcy in 2010. Additionally, you will hear from Aspen Bennett, a former employee of Fitzpatrick's, about the multiple instances where Fitzpatrick struggled to pay his employees on time and properly. We will show that the economic downturn was not a result of the state's COVID restrictions, but rather Fitzpatrick's poor business decision-making. Second, you will hear evidence that Buckeye's regulations did not destroy Fitzpatrick's investment-backed expectations and financial commitments. Restaurants have always been a highly regulated industry. In fact, the restaurant industry has regulations and restrictions dating back to 1934. Relator Fitzpatrick has experienced this firsthand, which Ellis Mazakis will testify to today. In order to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, Buckeye had to implement more restrictions. However, you will learn that Fitzpatrick's recent financial troubles were not the result of those restrictions. You will also hear evidence today from Ms. Bennett that Fitzpatrick refused to make necessary adjustments to adapt to the restrictions, another bad decision made by the restaurant. Third, you will hear evidence today that the character of the governmental action weighs against finding a partial regulatory taking. The goal of Buckeye's pandemic response was to protect public health. One of the early responses to the pandemic was a temporary stay-at-home order for all non-essential businesses and workers, which included restaurants to prevent the spread of disease. Ms. Mazakis will also reveal today how the government works to ensure that shutdowns did not last longer than necessary. Now, when new pandemic restrictions were implemented, the government provided advice and even exemptions to these regulations when it was found to be safe. The state of Buckeye dutifully protected the health of the public while offering assistance to businesses affected by the pandemic. Hollis Fitzpatrick failed to adapt to the pandemic while still facing other self-inflicted problems. At the end of today's trial, my co-counsel will ask that you find that the government's pandemic restrictions do not amount to a partial regulatory taking of Fitzpatrick's for public use. Today, it is a duty of the court to recognize that Fitzpatrick's closure was not a government taking, but just poor decision-making. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Relator, will you present your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Hollis Fitzpatrick. Please state your name for the court.
My name is Hollis Fitzpatrick.
And can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, my family's owned Fitzpatrick's for decades. Most of my memories from my childhood are associated with Fitzpatrick's. And just over a decade ago, my parents retired and I started running the business.
And can you tell a little bit how you run Fitzpatrick?
Yeah, the goal has always been to try to keep prices low and to try to make as few drastic changes as possible so our clients know what to expect. Really, the only major changes we've made have been a few minor, really wasn't major, but minor changes on the menu. We switched to organic produce and altered a couple of the items a bit. We've always been trying to run the business efficiently, even though we do keep our prices quite low. We still make a pretty decent profit.
And what did the profit margin look like for you?
Before the pandemic, it was about 3% and growing every year since about 2015.
And how does it look like for Fitzpatrick today?
Today, there is no Fitzpatrick's. On December 12, 2020, I made the hardest decision of my life, and I shut down Fitzpatrick's.
I'm very sorry to hear that, but can you tell me a bit more about why you think that happened?
Why? It's because the government restrictions. After over 2 months of us being completely shut down, they gave insane things for us to have to complete to be able to survive. We just couldn't. The restrictions were just too great.
Your Honor, at this moment, I would like to introduce the exhibit that has been previously stipulated as Exhibit D.
Any objections from the respondents?
No, Your Honor.
Then proceed.
Okay. Mr. Fitzpatrick, could you tell us a little bit why you couldn't operate with a profit?
To operate with a profit, I needed to be able to support about 2/3 of my patrons, and we couldn't even get half of the patrons to fit into our business. We could only fit about 16 seats of people instead of the past 34. And we also lost a major part of our dinner rush with the restrictions cutting us off at 6 p.m. instead of 8.
And moving on, can you tell me about some of the things that you've done to change the situation?
Yeah, we tried doing online ordering, but the website didn't really work out well. And we also did takeout through the phone. I worked with people and a designer, pretty much, to try to maximize the area that we could use in the restaurant to see if we could move stuff around and find a way to get to 2/3. And we also used online resources to try the same, but neither worked. No matter how we did it, the best we could get was 16 out of 34 seats. And we also couldn't really support a takeout delivery system, like with online websites, because there was not enough space in front of our restaurant.
And was the financial situation before the pandemic similar to the one you had during the pandemic?
Absolutely not. Before the pandemic, we were doing so well, we actually invested in the business. I made multiple, actually, very reasonable, profitable at the time expectations on our business by investing in things such as pinball machines, an ice cream machine, a soft serve machine. We updated our POS system, and we even got a projector to show sports events.
And circling back, I would like to talk about the interior renovations you did to Fitzpatrick that you mentioned. Who did those?
I actually did most of those myself because I was trying to be a smart business owner and not spend too much money, because if you don't know, plumbing gets really expensive. It's insane how expensive it is. Unfortunately, I did get cited by the health department for a few of those things. They couldn't really get us for our cleanliness, so they had to get us on some technical violation. Sometimes I wonder if they have like a quota.
So if you're describing them as unreasonable, what words would you use to describe the pandemic restrictions?
The pandemic restrictions, they were preposterous, unacceptable. There was just no words to describe how unbelievably impossible they were for us to survive through. And the worst part is they didn't even uniformly reinforce them.
What do you mean that they were not uniformly enforced?
Yeah, Governor DeBeer allowed a movie being filmed on March 19th, 2020 to serve food and beverages until they were done filming for the night. And many of his friends in the restaurant industry also got these exemptions that just didn't exist for the rest of us.
And how long did it take them to get back to you?
Can you go back a second? Can you go back and repeat what you just said?
Of course. And how long did it take the government to respond back to you on the exemption process?
The exemption process, it took a long time. It took about a month. They told me pretty much though that it didn't exist yet. Just threw me out the door, even though others had already gotten exemptions. I was slightly confused how there was no exemption process if there were exemptions in place, but they told me it didn't exist yet.
And then, what do you wish would have happened to your business?
I just wanted a chance to survive. Before the government's shutting down of restaurants and the insane restrictions, I was doing well and doing better by the year. But once the government's restrictions went into play, I was just completely destroyed. Fitzpatrick's had no financial viable way to survive. I needed help for the government, not to get hurt by him. Like, isn't that what government's supposed to do? Help us, not hurt us?
Thank you, Your Honor. No more questions.
Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Fitzpatrick. I'm going to be asking you some questions today. A simple yes or no answer will suffice. First, I'd like to talk to you about the history of Fitzpatrick's. Fitzpatrick's restaurant has been around for a long time, correct?
Yes, it's been around forever. It's structuralized into the makings of our town.
And finances haven't always been easy with Fitzpatrick's, though, correct?
Originally, no, but they've gone so much better up until the pandemic.
And your family has always kept the food prices low, correct?
We thought that was the best thing because we wanted our patrons to feel welcome and homely at our restaurant.
And as a result, profit margins for the restaurant were always slim, right?
Slim, but by the time before the restrictions hit with the pandemic, they were doing quite well. We'd gone past just the idea of a family legacy. It was a real sturdy business.
But you do agree that profit margins have been slim for the restaurant due to the low prices that you guys enacted, correct?
They were about 3%, which is, as far as I know, the average.
But they were low, correct? They have been low because of your lower prices?
Yeah, they were 3%, which is the lower half of the average.
And so you admit that you've been lucky that your partner makes such a great salary?
I mean, it is nice to have a partner who brings in money on herself, too. I mean, it's never the worst thing.
Agreed, but you do admit that it is nice to have a partner that makes such a great salary, right?
What did say?
Could you please repeat that? Something happened with the audio.
Oh, I made an objection of relevance to the case. Might not have been heard.
Oh, I didn't hear it. I would have stopped the proceedings.
Oh.
So what is your objection, and to what evidence are you objecting?
Asking about the partner and its salary, I'm objecting the relevance because today we're discussing the relevant to the case.
Is there a response to that objection?
Yes, Your Honor. I was simply talking about how profit margins have been slim at the restaurant and how Hollis always had something to rely back on because his partner made such a great salary. So I was just simply asking about his financial background in and out of Fitzpatrick.
How is that relevant to the case?
I would say that it's relevant because it deals with how Fitzpatrick ran his business, and because he had that financial stability at home, that could provide a reason as to why profit margins were kept slim, because it has been a family-owned business for many years.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, I was referring to your opposing counsel. My apologies. Is there anything further from the relator's attorneys?
Yes, Your Honor. They owned the business together, but the profits, as Hollis Fitzpatrick said, were within the average. They were on the lower part, but they were still within the average. So,
Thank you. Overruled. Please continue.
Things were really tough for the restaurant during the Great Recession of 2008, correct?
Like at many other small businesses, yes.
Okay, so let's talk more about 2020 and the beginning of the pandemic. So at the start of 2020, Fitzpatrick's had a slow start to the year, correct?
Every year, January and February aren't where we start off. We get real busy though, starting at Fitzpatrick's Day, because the restaurant's name is Fitzpatrick's. And after that, it picks up. But this year, we weren't able to get that same pickup because we were shut down right before our business booms for the year.
But that is a yes, correct?
Like every year, yes.
So Governor DeBeer closed all bars and restaurants on March 15th, 2020 due to the COVID-19 virus, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you applied and received a Paycheck Protection loan from the Small Business Administration, correct?
Yes, I did.
And so that was for $125,000?
I believe so.
And with that money, you hired a high school student to build a website for Fitzpatrick's?
The main use of that money was actually to pay the salaries of my employees. We used a sub part of the money to try to build the website.
Okay. And the website experience was a nightmare, correct?
Yes, that's probably because we didn't put so much money into it because we had to pay our employees with the payment protection loan.
Sure. And there were constant errors in the orders, correct?
Yep.
And then as a result, you ended up shutting down the website?
We thought that was the best business decision at the time.
And also, you would only take to-go orders over the phone?
That was what followed after we decided the website was not the best decision.
Yes. And you didn't try to hire someone else to fix the website?
We didn't have the money. We put the money in on the first attempt, but we didn't save enough money for that because we had to pay our employees.
Sure, but after seeing that the website failed, you didn't attempt to hire someone else to fix it or improve upon it?
Yet again, I just answered that. We didn't have the funds to do it because we spent the money to pay our employees because that's what the payment protection loan was for.
Sure. And so you knew you were only getting a fraction of the orders over the phone than you would if you would have kept the website up and running, correct?
You could say that, but we believed that that was not the right decision for us to make, and we moved just to the phone and to people coming in our business like we used to.
Sure. Okay, I'd like to talk to you about restaurant regulations now. You admit that restaurants are heavily regulated under the health code, correct?
Under certain parts, yes.
And when restaurants were permitted to reopen by Governor DeBeer, there were several regulations that were required to be followed, correct?
Several regulations, more like several death sentences.
But you do agree that there were several regulations that had to be followed because the government enacted them, correct?
Yes.
And on June 3rd, 2020, you requested an exemption from the state for the restrictions, right?
Yes, I did.
And, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Thank you for your answer. The health department replied, stating that there was no mechanism to make a request for an exemption, correct?
Yeah, but they took a month, and restaurants is a business of days, hours, minutes. By then, it was too late for us to even take a chance. They took way too long for us to get a chance to survive that response.
Sure, but there was no mechanism to make this request for an exemption at this point in time, right?
They had no apparent mechanism, but they still had given exemptions to his friends in a movie.
But Mr. Fitzpatrick, I'm asking about the reply that the health department gave you, seeing that there
Yes,
was
they stated there was no mechanism,
Yeah.
even though there had been exemptions already granted.
Okay, and then another restriction is that employees and customers were required to wear masks, correct?
Correct, which wasn't always the favorite thing in some of our patrons, but we did heavily enforce that rule. We did not let people come in without masks.
And as a result, the Fitzpatrick's employees hated enforcing those rules, correct?
Yes, we did not like enforcing those rules because many of our patrons who had been coming for years on end, decades even, didn't want to follow those rules, and it's kind of a hassle. It's just something they didn't feel like they were paid to do.
Sure. And so they would not dine anyone at Fitzpatrick's if they were required to wear masks?
Some patrons did decide that. Others would be willing to put it on just until they sat down.
Okay, and so you applied for an exemption the second time on November 4th, 2020, correct?
Correct.
And the health department wrote back and asked for more information, correct?
Yes, and yet again, they took so much time asking for more information. By then, we were dead. We were closed. There wasn't a chance for the exemptions to help us.
True, but they did come back with a response and ask you for more information about your
They
restaurant.
asked for more information after such an unreasonable amount of time. We had no chance. Correct.
And so you never responded with the information that they requested, did you?
We were shut down.
But you still, at the end of the day, did not respond with the information that they had originally requested from you, correct?
What's the point of responding information with a closed business?
Okay, so many of the restaurants in Harmony were getting good business around this time, correct?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
Sorry.
Sure, no problem. Many of the restaurants in Harmony were getting good business around this time, though, correct?
Correct.
And those restaurants were using food delivery platforms like Ultra Eats and Door Delivery, correct?
Yes, but like I said earlier, we couldn't use those based on the space in front of our business provided.
Sure, but those other successful restaurants during this time were using those food delivery platforms, yes or no?
Yes, they had the money to use those in the space.
And so you never attempted to use those services for Fitzpatrick's, correct?
Like I just said, we thought about it, but we knew it wouldn't work based on the space in front of our business.
Okay, no further questions, Your Honor.
Is there any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor, there is one.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Fitzpatrick, what were the regulations imposed on your restaurant when you were allowed to reopen?
Oh, the regulations? We were pretty much pushed down. We could have to had every other table empty and about 6 feet of space in between different tables. And based on the layout of our restaurant, that wouldn't work. And then another big part is our usual dinner rush was from 5 to 8, but businesses were shut down at 6. And by businesses, I mean restaurants.
Did you try to change the situation in your restaurant to still make profit under the regulations?
Of course, we tried everything we could. We worked with online designers and actual in-person designers. I tried everything. We just couldn't shift our space around and find a way to make it work.
Okay. And then why weren't you able to use the food delivery apps like many others did?
Well, first of all, it takes a very large sum of money to start to run those. And also, even if we had that money, we didn't have the space in front of our business to do this and perform this type of operation.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. No more questions.
Thank you. Is there any recross?
No, Your Honor.
Very well. Tori, you may now call your second witness. Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Your Honor.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
My name is Finley Ibarra, and I'm currently the director of the Buckeye Restaurant Association.
Could you go ahead and tell me a little bit more about your profession?
Yeah, I've been the director of the Restaurant Association since 2010, when I was recruited for my experience, my good reputation for getting things done. As director, it is my responsibility to make sure that restaurants of every size are represented at the local, state, and federal levels within Buckeye. I really strive to create a flourishing restaurant and food service industry.
So Mr. Ibarra, how did you get into this profession?
My first job in high school was actually bussing tables at Fitzpatrick's, which gave me a first-hand glimpse into the restaurant industry. And by the time I graduated high school, I knew I wanted to go into the restaurant business. So I went to Cornell on a scholarship in the Food Industry Management program. I then obtained my bachelor's degree from Cornell in 1979.
What did you learn from your bachelor's degree?
I really learned how to apply real cutting-edge theories around real-world issues facing the food industries and how to respond to that as a business leader. And I got a lot of experience in successful and unsuccessful business strategies, marketing, and leadership experience.
Could you elaborate on these experiences, please?
Personally, I used my education and bought my own restaurant right out of college. I purchased a JoJo's Sub Shop franchise, but it was quickly shut down due to a lack of seating arrangements and the economic recession.
Did you learn anything from the closure of your shop?
Yeah, from the failure, I learned how franchises start and get running, as well as what causes them to close. Knowing more about small franchises allowed me to communicate with smaller businesses and understand what they needed. This helped me create the perfect insurance plan for my new job, or for them for my new job.
Your Honor, at this time, under Rule 702, I move for Finley Ibarra to be qualified as an expert in the field of food industry management.
Is there any objection from the respondents?
Yes, Your Honor, there is an objection. May I explain?
You certainly may.
Opposing counsel has proven that the witness has a bachelor's degree but does not have any higher education, such as a PhD, to be considered an expert witness in this field, according to Rule 702. Finley Ibarra fails to meet the criteria.
Your Honor, may I respond?
You may.
Finley Ibarra has extensive knowledge in the industry of food industry management. Like I said before, he owned a franchise. He learned a lot from that experience. He went to a top university and got a scholarship in the food industry management program. And throughout his entire life, he has been involved in the restaurant industry since high school, in fact.
Would respondents care to add anything to their objection?
No, Your Honor.
Very well. He will be recognized as an expert in the field of restaurant management.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Mr. Ibarra, do you remember when COVID-19 restrictions were put in place?
Yes, of course. They caused a huge ruckus in the restaurant industry. They were way more severe than any other regulations the restaurant industry has ever been subjected to before.
Mr. Ibarra, based on your education, training, and experience, what was the effect of these restrictions on the restaurant industry?
The regulations were hastily placed without restaurants in mind. Restaurants were the first to close and the last to open, and small businesses like Fitzpatrick's definitely suffered the most.
Could you elaborate on how Fitzpatrick suffered from the regulations?
Well, the mandated 6 p.m. curfew slashed Fitzpatrick's revenue because those were during peak business hours, and the dinner rush can turn a table 3 times over. And the 6 feet apart rule, seating rule, forced her to cut on half of her customers. I mean, he only owned a very small business, and logistically, he couldn't have rearranged the seating.
Mr. Ibarra, did you see Fitzpatrick make any attempt to try and adapt to these restrictions?
Yes, of course. Myself personally and Fitzpatrick both tried to use an online platform to promote business, change the layout, and even add a drive-through window. but there just wasn't enough money or square footage to achieve these goals. I mean, the government regulations were super strict, yet even inconsistent.
Could you elaborate on inconsistent?
On one hand, small restaurants like Fitzpatrick's were completely shut down and forced to close. On the other hand, catering businesses could still operate when they catered on movie sets.
So, Mr. Ibarra, aside from these movie sets, were there any other way for restaurants to obtain an exemption from these mandates?
Not for businesses like Fitzpatrick's. Our members were not provided with the procedural recourse in time to save their businesses and get relief from these orders. Members like Fitzpatrick's asked for a chance to be heard, but those cries for help were ignored by the government when they took a month to respond twice. Fitzpatrick was not able to operate their business due to strict restrictions and needed some sort of quick reprieve to save their restaurant. A business that had been around for generations and was even on the incline was forced to close just like that, and the government did not care.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Anything further from the respondents?
Can we introduce our cross-examination, Your
Oh,
Honor?
yeah, I'm a witness behind. I apologize. Yes, is there a cross-examination?
Yes, there is, Your Honor.
Proceed whenever you're ready, then.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Ibarra. I will be asking you some questions today. A simple yes or no answer will suffice. You first worked at Fitzpatrick's bussing tables in high school, correct?
I did. It was a long time ago when I was in high school, and I needed a first job, so I just decided to get a job at a local restaurant.
And that is a yes.
Yes, but it was a long time ago, like I said.
And after you graduated high school, you pursued a bachelor's degree from Cornell University, right?
Yes, in the food industry management program. I got a scholarship to it as well.
And you stated that Cornell exposed you to successful and unsuccessful business strategies, correct?
Yes. Yes. The bachelor's degree did teach me that.
Thank you. And you never went back to get your PhD in this field, correct?
No, I didn't need to.
Sorry. Moving on, you actually ran a business in 1979, correct?
Yes.
And it failed within just a year, right?
Yes, like I said, due to the economic recession at the time, and it was really small, I couldn't get the necessary seating arrangements to make it work.
Thank you. And between 1980 and 1983, you kept moving from job to job, correct?
Yes, but I ended up working in the insurance field and helping restaurants find the perfect insurance fit for them.
Thank you. I'd now like to talk to you about Fitzpatrick's. You know the risks that food businesses have to face on a day-to-day basis, correct?
Yes.
And even when times were good, before COVID-19 restrictions were placed, you stated that businesses like Fitzpatrick's were barely making enough money, right?
Yeah, the 3 to 5% profit was enough to survive, but it wasn't a lot. But they still survived on it, and it was enough.
Your Honor, we're having a little bit of a technical issue right now. We're trying to work that out as quickly as we can.
All right, would the timekeepers please stop the clock?
Your Honor, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, thank you. Do you need the question repeated, Mr. Ibarra?
I would like to have it repeated, please.
All right.
So let's start back on the clock.
Okay, thank you. Okay, even when times were good, before COVID-19 restrictions were placed, you stated that businesses like Fitzpatrick's were barely making enough money, right?
They were making around 3 to 5% profit, and it was enough to survive at that time.
But the answer is yes, right?
It was enough to survive.
And also, you stated that Fitzpatrick's was not perfect throughout its history, right?
No restaurant is perfect.
And because of your experience with business strategies, you'd say that spending money when you don't have enough is a bad decision making, correct?
At the time, their profit was enough, and they decided to spend the money the way they did, and it worked for them at the time.
Again, but spending money when you don't have enough just is bad decision making, right?
If they don't have enough, but at that time they didn't. They had enough to spend the money.
Okay, moving on. The restaurant business has been regulated for almost 90 years by the FDA and U.S. Public Health Service, correct?
Yes.
And those regulations included restrictions on hand washing and hygiene for staff.
Yes.
And in fact, the restaurant industry is used to having restrictions on the sanitization of surfaces, occupancy restrictions, and other public health and safety orders, right?
Yes.
And you're also aware of the extensive number of health code violations received by Fitzpatrick's, correct?
Yeah, I am aware.
And you're also aware that the health code was created to keep restaurant goers safe, right?
Yes, but none of the health code violations were enough to make it close.
The answer is still a yes.
Yes.
Thank you. On a similar note, I'd like to talk about some comments of yours regarding the pandemic shutdowns and restrictions. You stated that your industry was singled out by the government, right?
Yes, I did say that.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to introduce a clean and unmarked copy of Exhibit B. May I approach the witness?
Well, I'm not sure there's any approaching, but you're certainly welcome to display the exhibits.
Thank you, Your Honor. And we're working out a technical issue right now.
Should we pause the time?
How much longer will you be? Do you know?
We have a couple more questions after this.
No, I mean to remedy the technical
I can
problem.
share the exhibit for you if that's what if you want me to.
Thank you. We'd really appreciate that.
1 second. Which one is it again? Sorry.
Exhibit B, please.
B.
B.
This one.
So, oh wait, now it's loading. B is in like boy.
Oh, B and boy. Sorry.
Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. Official Buckeye Department of Health webpage, right?
Yes.
Could you please follow along as I read the executive order from March 18th, 2020? Governor's orders to close salons, tattoo parlors, barbershops, day spas, and tanning facilities.
Yes.
Did I read that correctly?
Yeah.
So other businesses and industries were subject to temporary governmental restrictions, right?
Yes, but as you see, as says in the exhibit, restaurants and bars were the first to close.
Yes, so there were other industries that were subject to regulations, right?
Of course.
Thank you. Moving on, I have just a couple more questions to ask. You're here testifying on behalf of the Fitzpatrick family, correct?
Yeah.
And you have close ties with the family, right?
I wouldn't say I have extremely close ties. I have good relation. Like I said, I've worked with restaurants in the local, state, and federal level for years, and I always represent my restaurants, and I have a pretty good connection with all my restaurants.
But you are aware that in your witness statement, you did mention that you have close ties with the family, right?
But like I said, I have close ties with all of the restaurant owners.
And especially the family?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Pause.
I just would like a yes answer, a no answer, Your Honor.
Overruled. Please continue.
Thank you. So again, you do have close ties with the family?
Yes, but I like I said, I had close ties with all the restaurant owners.
Thank you. And you've been familiar with the Fitzpatrick family before your high school employment, correct?
Yes.
And it's true that before the pandemic, you visited the restaurant on a monthly basis, correct?
Like I said, I visited all my restaurants. I had very good ties with all my restaurants.
And that this one was visited on a monthly basis, right?
And so were my other restaurants. I visited them all.
So the answer is a yes.
Yes, it was. I did visit on a monthly basis, but like I said, I visited them all.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Very well. You are free to go. Thank you. Does the relator have any other evidence to present?
No, Your Honor.
Respondents, will you present your first witness, please?
Yes, Your Honor. We would like to call Aspen Bennett. Please state your name for the court.
My name is Aspen Bennett.
What is your current place of employment?
My current place of employment is the Harmony Bistro.
And what was your previous place of employment?
I actually used to work at Fitzpatrick's, but I ended up leaving there in September of 2020, and I've never been happier, honestly.
I would like to talk to you about your experience with Fitzpatrick's restaurants prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, what was your initial impression of the Fitzpatrick's restaurant?
Initially, I really liked working there at first. The staff was fairly small, mainly family, and we would walk around the dining room and just chat with our customers. It really gave me the impression that they were committed to that family, homey feel, and I really liked that.
So how, if at all, did this feeling change as time went on?
As time went on, I started to notice things that made me question the restaurant as a whole, Fitzpatrick's.
So what things in particular made you question Fitzpatrick's?
The restaurant itself was disgusting. There were leaks in the kitchen, sketchy outlets, and electrical work in the dining room.
So what, if anything, did you do in response to these electrical and plumbing issues?
I tried to bring it up to Hollis, but they said I was just overreacting and dismissed it because they didn't have the money to fix it.
And so how did Fitzpatrick respond to the electrical and plumbing issues in the dining room of the restaurant?
Hollis would fix it on their own instead of hiring a professional to do it.
And so what happened after Fitzpatrick fixed these issues on his own?
The plumbing situation was just bad, if not worse. The plumbing started backing up dirty dishwater into the sink, where we would clean dishes and we would prep salads. Servers would just avoid the electrical outlets in the bathroom because sometimes we were shocked while we were trying to wash our hands.
And so how, if at all, did the health department respond to these issues in the dining room?
The health department actually cited Fitzpatrick's for health code violations.
And so what observations did you make about the quality of food at Fitzpatrick's?
The food wasn't sanitary or tasty. I didn't even eat it, actually. I was worried that it might make someone sick. Nothing was ever made fresh, and everything came from a package in the freezer.
And so how, if at all, did this affect your customers?
The customers seemed offset by the disgusting state of the restaurant. I don't really think they even liked the food.
And so how did the customers who frequented Fitzpatrick's use the space?
They used it more of a gathering place than a restaurant.
And so why was using the restaurant as a gathering place an issue?
I mean, we were lucky enough to turn over tables maybe 2 times in a service.
And why is this a cause for concern for a restaurant?
Because in a small place like Fitzpatrick's, you really can't afford to just have tables sticking around and not eating very much.
Okay, so now I would like to talk to you about the restaurant's financial situation prior to the pandemic. How was the restaurant doing financially prior to the pandemic occurring?
Fitzpatrick wasn't making any money, at least not enough money to comfortably pay their staff.
And so what, if any, issues were there with paying staff members?
I mean, payday was extremely stressful. Every time it came around, I was always so stressed.
So why was payday stressful?
Hollis was either late on paying us employees or would give us a personal check instead of like an official one from a business account.
So now I would like to talk to you about your experience with Fitzpatrick's after the pandemic had started. So what did the health department do in response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
They closed in-person dining in restaurants.
What did restaurants do in response to this closure?
The restaurants quickly transitioned to takeout options just to stay open and thriving during the pandemic.
And so what, if any, takeout options did Fitzpatrick's offer to stay open during the pandemic?
Fitzpatrick solely did orders over the phone.
So how, if at all, did you attempt to help Hollis Fitzpatrick with this transition?
I had offered Hollis suggestions on how to make takeout work so we could have a bigger sale.
And so what suggestions did you make regarding takeout options?
I actually brought up using Ultra Eats or door delivery takeout options because they were really popular in Harmony already. And I offered to actually use my own personal social media accounts to spread the word of Fitzpatrick's and get the small business idea going on social media platforms. Yeah.
And so what was Fitzpatrick's response to this suggestion?
He dismissed it.
And so what, if any, other suggestions did you make to help the operations of Fitzpatrick?
I brought up an idea about bagged lunch options that people could easily call in to order and pick up from the counter. And I also suggested about setting up a hostess to stand in the doorway as a makeshift takeout window.
And what was Fitzpatrick's responses to these suggestions?
Again, he dismissed these as well.
Okay, so now I would like to talk about the restaurant operations after they were allowed to reopen. So when were restaurants allowed to reopen in the state of Buckeye?
May 21st of 2020.
And so what, if any, restrictions were there for the restaurants reopening?
Tables needed to be spaced out, capacity was limited, and restaurants had to close early.
And so how did Fitzpatrick follow these restrictions regarding tables being spaced out?
Hollis didn't space out the tables. He kept them in the same configuration and just closed off the bigger tables. He was even against the idea of subbing out the smaller tables for the larger ones.
And how would have smaller tables helped the restaurant?
I believe it would have allowed Fitzpatrick to seat more people because then more tables could fit.
And so how, if at all, did all of these issues affect your employment at Fitzpatrick's?
I actually, with all of this, I ended up quitting near the end of September.
And so why did you end up quitting your job at Fitzpatrick's restaurant?
Hollis just refused to change their ways of operating this restaurant even after the pandemic, and they just horribly managed their business, and I just needed better things in my life and a better working career.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Good morning, Mrs. Bennett. So, you've said that you were working in the restaurant industry since high school, correct?
This is true. My first job was actually at an ice cream parlor, and then I worked at a restaurant called Antonio's for around 3 years.
Okay, and then you also used to work at Fitzpatrick's, correct?
This is true, yes, before Harmony Bistro.
However, at both Fitzpatrick's and Antonio's, you recall some serious accusations of you stealing money from the register, yes?
Objection, relevant.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm merely setting up the foundation to show that Aspen Bennett has bias in her previous testimony on her experience at Fitzpatrick's restaurant.
Is there any reply to that response?
Yes, Your Honor. Opposing counsel is hinting that Aspen Bennett had trouble at her previous place of employment, and this is not relevant because she is not on trial here, and the trial that we are here for today is Hollis Fitzpatrick versus the state of Buckeye, so therefore her testimony about an accusation that was spread around at that restaurant is not relevant today.
Overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Miss Bennett, would you like me to restate the question?
Sorry, could you please repeat that?
You recall some serious accusations of you stealing money from the register at both Antonio's and Fitzpatrick's, correct?
At Antonio's, they were just, accusations, and I did end up pleading guilty only because my parents couldn't afford a lawyer, so that was our best option. I only had to serve a few community service hours and just a small fine. And at Fitzpatrick's, it was just a rumor after I'd quit.
So you did leave Fitzpatrick's?
I did leave Fitzpatrick's, yes.
And but while you were working at Fitzpatrick's, he made several changes to their restaurant to improve business and attract customers. Correct?
Not the ones that I suggested to him, no.
But he did change the menu. He put in a pinball machine and other changes to attract customers while you were there. Correct?
Yes, if you're referring to the fresh options on the menu that he did to change, that I actually suggested to him, he just took in produce from his garden at home and he labeled them organic on the menu.
Okay. But all of these efforts, they all displayed that Fitzpatrick was trying to improve business. Correct?
I honestly wouldn't say so because I effortlessly tried to suggest new things to him. It actually wasn't even my business. I was just an employee there, and I constantly suggested new things with takeout, new dining arrangements, but he really never took up to any of them.
So moving on, Fitzpatrick kept you on the payroll during the financially tough coronavirus times, right?
He did, yes, because I was an employee for a while. So he did have to cut off non-family members, but he did keep me on staff, which I'm very grateful for during those trying times.
He would also even pay you from his own personal checks.
Yes, he would.
And you would always receive your proper payment, correct?
I did, yes.
And you were always able to quit Fitzpatrick's?
I'm sorry, what?
You were always able to quit Fitzpatrick's, correct?
Yes, I was.
Okay. So you said that you recommended to Fitzpatrick to use delivery services, correct?
I did, yes.
Are you aware that the delivery services are very expensive?
That was his response to me. But I'd seen a lot of other small businesses around Harmony doing the same thing. So I suggested it to him because we really weren't making a profit during the pandemic. So I was just trying everything that I could to suggest at least something because he wasn't really changing his ways.
That's understandable. You also recommended for Fitzpatrick to include outdoor seating, right?
I did, yes. We have a back alley where we took our break, and he said that it wasn't suitable and it was for employees only. But I only suggested that because, again, I'd seen restaurants around Harmony doing the exact same thing, using parking lots and the spaces in front of the restaurants. So I figured that we could definitely do something to make it work.
You were aware that the sidewalk outside of Fitzpatrick's was too small for outdoor seating?
I was aware of that, yes.
And you were also aware that the back alley was not suitable for dining, so you would agree that Hollis had no way to implement outdoor seating at Fitzpatrick's.
Objection, Your Honor. Compound question.
Response?
No response, Your Honor. May I restate the question?
Yes, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. There was no way for Fitzpatrick's to accommodate the indoor seating restrictions, correct?
I'm sorry, did you mean outdoor?
Oh, sorry, yes, outdoor.
Again, I think that there could have been a little bit more effort put into it because the other restaurants in the area were doing the exact same thing. But I can agree, in these conditions, it was harder.
Moving on to indoor seating restrictions. Fitzpatrick's restaurant was pretty small, you would say.
I would say it was small, yes.
Despite this, though, Fitzpatrick tried his best to accommodate to these indoor restrictions.
I don't think that he tried his very best to accommodate to them. He kind of just left things as they were, so he didn't really accommodate at all, I would say.
You wouldn't say that reconfiguring the entire space of his longtime family-owned business was an attempt?
I guess it was, yes. Not that great of an attempt, again, as the other restaurants were making, so business was still a lot slower than it already was.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Is there any redirect?
No, Your Honor. Thank you very much.
Very well, you may be excused then. Does the respondent have a second witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The respondent would like to call Alice Mazakis to the stand.
Sorry, who's being called? Who's being called?
Did we freeze at one point? I couldn't hear anything, Your Honor.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, Your Honor.
Who's being called?
We would like to call Mazakis to the stand, please.
Thank you.
May I proceed?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Mazakis. Please state your name for the court.
Alice Mazakis.
What is your occupation?
I'm the director of I'm the director of Buckeye Health and Human Services.
And how long have you worked there?
I've worked there for over 20 years.
And what are your credentials for this occupation?
I have a bachelor's from the University of Arizona in health services, and I have a master's degree. Oh, that's from 1994, and then I have a master's. I'm sorry.
No worries. Your Honor, pursuant to Rule 702, I declare Alice Mazakis a public health expert.
Is there any response?
Yes, Your Honor. I have no objection, as we will address the questions in cross.
Very well. She is tendered or recognized as an expert.
Your Honor, would it be possible for us to have a minute?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Respondents, will you need much longer?
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Are we ready to proceed?
I'm sorry. I just have really bad anxiety issues, and I was having a little bit of a panic attack. So I'm very sorry for disrupting the trial.
It can be very
But I can
distressing
continue. Can we start? Alright.
It can be very distressing to testify, I understand. So take your time, take a deep breath, and whenever you're ready, you may start either where you left off or at the beginning, whichever you choose.
Can we start at the beginning?
That's me, not me. Alright, very good. Wait, can they hear me? Yes. Alright, I'm sorry. Microphone. Okay, cool. We figured out a technical issue too, Your Honor. But good afternoon, Ms. Mazakis. Please state your name for the court.
Alice Mazakis.
And what is your occupation? I am the Buckeye Director of Health and Human Services.
And how long have you worked there?
I am proud to have worked for over 20 years.
And what are your credentials for this occupation?
I earned a bachelor's degree I earned a bachelor's degree for health services at the University of Arizona in 1994, and I also obtained a master's degree at the Buckeye State University in 2000 for public health, and then I obtained an MD, which is Doctor of Medicine, in emphasis in epidemiology in 2004.
Your Honor, pursuant to Rule 702, I declare Ellis Mazakis a public health expert.
Sure. Any response?
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. She is so recognized. Please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. What is the mission
Sorry, you're good.
of the Buckeye Department of Health?
To me, the mission is to make decisions in the public's best interest. It's providing effective health and human services for fostering advances in like social services. So basically just, again, doing the best for the public good.
And what kinds of policies do you typically deal with?
We tend to have to work a lot with other people and just things with like medical care, food and drug, and disease prevention and control.
And what are your responsibilities in your department?
Some of it is overseeing the policies, partaking in the department, and doing things like such as like working together with other people, and dealing with things such as the COVID-19 pandemic.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about the department's grading system for restaurants. Could you explain the grading system for restaurants?
The grading system is letter based, so it's like letters like A, B, and C, just like letters like that. And the FDA food code, of course. There's 56 different inspection like codes that you have to meet in order for the restaurant to be completely compliant. If you were to meet all 56, but basically, in order for the various inspections, stuff like that, and that makes up the grade of the restaurant.
And what grade did Fitzpatrick's receive?
A B minus.
Objection, Your Honor.
At this time, I would like to introduce a clean and unmarked copy of Exhibit A.
There's an objection, I believe.
Yes, there
What
was.
are the grounds for the objection?
Okay. I believe that the question that was asked was about the rating that Fitzpatrick received, and I objected.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. We've had some sound issues.
On what basis do you object?
On basis of relevance under the Rule 402, because it was before the pandemic. And as I said before here, we're discussing the impact of the COVID-19 regulations on Fitzpatrick Restaurant during the pandemic, and that was before that period of time.
Is there a response? I think you have frozen.
Yes. Sorry, we're having technical issues.
I understand. Happened in the first trial as well. Whenever you're ready, is there a response to the relevancy objection?
Yes, Your Honor, there is. To be able to properly evaluate how the pandemic restrictions affected Fitzpatrick's, we must also look at all the financial aspects and then health code violations related to Fitzpatrick's prior to the pandemic.
And is there a reply to that response?
Yes, Your Honor, because one of the things that for which Fitzpatrick received a B minus rating was plumbing, but plumbing doesn't necessarily connect to the problems that were caused by the restriction, which is the spread of the virus.
Thank you. Overruled. Please proceed.
I was just saying. Okay, so, Your Honor, again, should I proceed with my exhibit now?
Yes, if that's the next thing you were going to do, you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, I would like to introduce a clean and unmarked copy of Exhibit A, Part 2.
Are there any objections?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. Ms. Mazakis, could you explain this document to me? This is the book phone. Alright, we're gonna figure out a sound issue quick. This is the... And why did Fitzpatrick receive a B minus?
I believe I missed an answer. Would you mind starting over with the last question?
Okay. Could you explain these documents to me? This is the Buckeye Health Department Citations and Status Overview of Fitzpatrick's Restaurant. And why did Fitzpatrick's Restaurant receive a B minus? There were a lot of issues. This inspector specifically cited a lot of issues that were with plumbing, open circuits by flammable liquids, faded employee hand washing signs, and using things like produce from an unapproved vendor. And so, what does it mean if a restaurant is given this grade? They're still safe to patronize, but there's still some sort of violation leading to a B grade, like a vermin infestation, or temperature with crumping food, or like inadequate hand washing. And when did the inspection occur? January 24th, 2020. Let's talk about the state's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. How did the department respond to the COVID-19 pandemic? The department obviously developed proper guidelines and protocols to protect the public, and they did a temporary stay-at-home order for non-essential workers and businesses. And how did the public respond to these actions? Sadly, some actions and precautions were seen as harsh, but these protocols were implemented because we needed to protect the public against the highly contagious nature of COVID-19. And how did the department decide on these restrictions? My team and I worked with local restaurant owners to determine which restrictions would be the least burdensome and protect public health. And when were restaurants permitted to reopen outdoor dining? May 15th, 2020. And when were restaurants permitted to reopen indoor dining? May 21st, 2020. And what did restrictions for reopening include? Some of the restrictions were that they had to at least have a table of space in between every other table had to remain empty. There was 6 feet of clearance between tables. The total number of occupants, kitchen staff was reduced to 50%. And we also decided it'd be safest if we put plexiglass between the tables, that physical menus were prohibited, as well as everyone had to wear masks. And how did the department help restaurants adjust to these regulations? We released a memo that outlined what the restaurants needed to do, like helping them with things such as where to obtain plexiglass, how to develop a virtual menu, and how to maximize seating, just so we could do our best. And why were exemptions from the restrictions initially denied? We didn't really have a structure set in place. It really wasn't set, it also just wasn't safe to lift the restrictions just yet. We needed to gather data through time to allow business to resume when these restrictions were put back in place. So we had to reevaluate at a later time. Ms. Mazakis, were there any increases in COVID cases that the state noticed after the reopening of restaurants with restrictions? Yes, as time went on after July, Buckeye continued to see an increase in numbers in COVID-19 and also deaths. And how did the state respond to this? To prevent any more deaths, Governor DeBeer issued a mask mandate and also, for all counties on July 23rd, 2020, and also a curfew was assigned so that no large gatherings would take place. And what was the curfew's purpose? Like I said, it was just to make sure that we could combat the problem, to get rid of large gatherings and less time for people to be together. Now let's talk about the exemptions to the pandemic restrictions. Why were exemptions created? Eventually, COVID numbers began to increase, and we reevaluated our previous stances. By November, we were ready to completely lift the restrictions, but we were a little bit too optimistic, and the overall number of cases and community spread. And how were these exemptions created?
Governor DeBeer met with some of the business owners in the food industry and asked the health department to create an exemption process because we wanted to make sure that they could operate safely with the COVID-19 restrictions.
So what are some ways you could receive an exemption from the guidelines?
They were on kind of a case-by-case basis, and it was only granted if they could prove safe operation without restrictions, especially businesses with ventilation and airflow.
And when did Governor DeBeer announce the exemption process?
October 28th, 2020.
Ms. Mazakis, could you please tell me about Fitzpatrick's application for exemption?
Of course. For this process, we needed additional information to make a final decision. We sent them a letter that we received their application, but again, needed more information. We never received a follow-up after that.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Is there a cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor, there is one. May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Mazakis. I just have a few questions for you today. So the initial restrictions you made to the restaurant were soon lifted, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
If they were lifted, would you admit that the restrictions were initially too harsh, wouldn't you?
I did say they were harsh, but then again, they were needed, so.
But they were too harsh initially, right?
Yes, I did say that.
Okay. Moving on, let's talk about those very restrictions. So the restrictions due to COVID-19 apply to all restaurants in an equal measure, correct?
Yes, they all needed to be protected under the state, or else there was going to, have COVID run rampant all over the place.
So the requirements for all the restaurants were the same. That's what I asked, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay, but you would agree, though, that not all restaurants in Buckeye have the same square footage, wouldn't you?
I mean, of course, it's a case-by-case basis with every single restaurant. We need to evaluate every single restaurant, and also it's just needed that every restaurant is not the same.
That's not what I asked, though. I asked if the that you would agree that the square footage for different restaurants in Buckeye weren't the same, right?
Of course.
Okay, and you would also agree that not all restaurants in Buckeye have the same resources and the ability to comply, right?
Again, that's something we tried to help with. Of course, we showed them how to make virtual menus, how to obtain plexiglass. So if they had any problems, they could have just looked at our memo and stuff like that. So it wasn't that we didn't want to have a helping hand out.
Once again, I asked that not all restaurants have the same resources and the ability to comply, right?
They could have gotten those resources if they just asked for them.
Well, the answer to my question is right. Yes?
I would say that if anyone wanted to get resources, they would be able to if they just asked for a helping hand.
Okay. Moving on, presumably the regulations had different effects on the restaurant of different sizes, right?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. So presumably the regulations had different effects on restaurants of different sizes, right?
I would say that yes.
Okay, and you would also agree then that therefore the restaurants of Buckeye were disproportionately impacted and hit more than others, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. There's no opposing counsel has no actual knowledge of this, and it's merely an assumption.
Response?
Oh, yes, Your Honor. So my previous question was that there was different effects on restaurants of different sizes. So my next question was a follow-up to that one.
What was the next question again?
My question was, so would Mrs. Mazakis agree that some restaurants were more impacted and hit than others?
And is there a reply to that response?
No, Your Honor.
Overruled. Please continue.
Should I restate the question?
Yes, you should.
So Ms. Mazakis, you would agree that some restaurants were hit and impacted more than others, right?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. Sorry, we had an issue.
So to clarify some things, one of the requirements for the reopened restaurant was the distance of exactly 6 feet between the tables, right?
Yes, I did say that.
And you would agree that there's no like a magical wall or distinction between 6 feet and 5 feet and 9 inches, for example, in order to prevent the spread of pathogens, wouldn't you?
Say that again. I'm so sorry.
There's no specific and scientific base for the distance to be exactly 6 feet and not, for example, 5 feet and 9 inches, right?
Objection. This is an irrelevant question.
Is there a response to the relevancy objection?
Yes, Your Honor. It's connected to the question I asked previously because I asked that was the distance between the tables exactly 6 feet, and the answer I was given is yes. So it was a follow-up on that question.
Any reply to that response?
Sorry. Again, the question about a magical wall between 5.9 feet and then 6 feet, there's just, it has nothing to do with the case at hand. And, it's nowhere in the case, I'm sorry, the witness statement.
Overruled. Please continue.
Should I repeat the question, Your Honor?
Yes, you should.
Okay. So you would agree that there's no scientific base for the distance to be exactly 6 feet and not 5 feet and 9 inches in order to prevent the spread of pathogens, wouldn't you?
I don't make all of the regulations. Again, it's a collaborative effort. So of course we have to collaborate with experts who think that 6 feet is the best and reasonable distance for tables to be spread apart. So of course we did that in our best interest and the public's best interest.
But just to clarify, there's no scientific evidence for exactly 6 feet distance, right?
There has to be some somewhere else. They wouldn't just pop it out of their hat. I mean,
okay, Your Honor, I would like to introduce the exhibit that has been previously stipulated as an Exhibit D. May I proceed?
If there are no objections, yes, you may.
There are no.
Okay. You see that most of the tables of Fitzpatrick are not occupied, right?
yes, we had to put that in order for our for the restaurants to be safe.
Okay, and if the distance has been a little bit smaller than 6 feet, you could see that maybe they could fit more restaurants and make more profit, right?
Again, that's just what we had to do. 6 feet was the appropriate amount of length that we had to put in between tables. If we did that, then COVID-19 would not spread as much, and that would be safer for all citizens.
Okay. To switch gears, let's move on to the exemption process itself. So when the exemption process was open on November 2nd, 2020, right?
Yes.
And it's reasonable to anticipate that because you got that a lot of people were hit by the restrictions and weren't happy with it, right?
Could you say that one more time? I'm so sorry.
Yes. So it's reasonable to anticipate that a lot of business owners who applied for the registration weren't happy with it, right?
You could infer that, yes.
Okay. And if talking about Hollis Fitzpatrick specifically, he asked for an exemption process more than once, right?
Yes, he did 2 times.
And then he tried to get the exemption before there was an expansion process in place, and he was refused to even consider it, right?
Could you state the last part of that question?
Sure. So when Hollis Fitzpatrick first asked for an exemption, he was refused to even consider it, right?
We didn't have a process set up yet, so of course we didn't want to just haphazardly just accept people for an exemptions when we didn't have a process set up, so we didn't want to do that.
He was refused, right?
There wasn't a process to begin with.
That's not what I asked. I asked whether he was refused.
If there wasn't a process, there wasn't a way to get an exemption.
Okay. And Your Honor, at this moment, I would like to introduce the exhibit that had been previously stipulated as an Exhibit F.
If there are no objections, you may.
There are no objections, Your Honor.
Okay. Ms. Mazakis, can you please identify this document?
Sorry, it's not loading yet. This is the transcript of Governor DeBeer's October 28th press conference.
And could you please read the first 2 sentences of the exhibit for me?
Sure, just let me zoom in real quick. Okay, I can read it now. We have seen tremendous support for local businesses, especially in the food service industry. I was talking with some close friends who own a small restaurant right here in Harmony, and they brought to my attention the need for an exemption process for some of the restrictions on local businesses.
So you were not able to help Hollis Fitzpatrick before because there wasn't an exemption process yet. But when your friends mentioned it, you created a whole process, right?
The process was needed. We wanted to make sure that, as I said in my witness statement, that we could allow that for people to start getting exemptions and that they could start running their business effectively and not be restricted, but also keeping a COVID-safe environment.
Yeah, but you created it after your friends pointed out that there was a problem, right?
We created it nonetheless.
Okay. And then once you had a process, it took you a very long time to get back to the businesses like Fitzpatrick, right?
We had more pressing matters at hand, of course, being the Buckeye Department of Health and Human Services. We have a lot of issues to deal with, especially with COVID-19 going on. Nothing is really a swift process in COVID-19 times.
Okay, but it still took you a long time to get back to them, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then while they were waiting for a response, some restaurants like Fitzpatrick closed, right?
Most restaurants did close, yes.
Okay. And while helping businesses is part of acting in the public's interest, some of the businesses, if not many, didn't get the help that would provide the opportunity to stay afloat, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. So, while the restaurant owners are also part of the public interest in the Buckeye community, some of them didn't get the help and couldn't stay afloat, right?
Justin, and that's not that because in Mrs. Robinson's statement indirectly, she mentioned how the government offered help to all businesses, especially with complying with pandemic restrictions.
And what is your objection?
Invention of fact.
That the question calls for invention of fact?
It does include yes, because this wasn't directly in the statement, I don't believe, and also Ms. Mazakis did testify earlier that the government offered help to businesses.
Any response to that objection?
Yes, Your Honor, that's not exactly me. There was a bad connection, but that's not exactly what I asked. So what I asked was that some of the businesses, while waiting for the help from the government to help stay afloat, didn't get it.
Okay, and the objection was invention of fact. How do you respond to that based on your question?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I must have misheard it then.
So you're withdrawing the objection?
Yes, Your Honor.
Very well, let's proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, lastly, Mrs. Mazakis, you were accused by the Ethics Committee of allowing your inspectors to take bribes, weren't you?
Yes, that is per protocol.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. No more questions.
Thank you. Is there a redirect?
No.
Very well. Doctor, you may step down. You're excused. Would the timekeeper please put 2 minutes on the clock and let us know when that time is up? The parties will have that amount of time to prepare for their closing statement.
Yes. When should I start that?
Start it now, please.
Okay. Time is up.
Thank you. Relatives, are you ready to proceed with closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor, I'm ready. May I
Proceed whenever.
Thank you, Your Honor. The Fifth Amendment of the United States guarantees that a person's private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation, but that is exactly what happened when the state imposed these very harsh regulations that went too far in regulating the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only did those regulations wipe out the business of Fitzpatrick, but it has also wiped out his dreams. Those very restrictions closed the door to Fitzpatrick forever and constituted taking under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Taking claims under the Fifth Amendment can fall within one of the three categories: a physical per se taking, a total regulatory taking, or a partial regulatory taking. The town by the pandemic restrictions implemented by the government falls under a partial regulatory taking, which is determined through a flexible test developed in the Supreme Court in Penn Central Transportation Company versus City of New York Supreme Court case. Under the Penn Central, there are three factors, and any one of them or a combination of the factors is enough to find a taking. The three factors are: 1, whether the imposed regulations cause substantial and irrecoverable economic ramifications to Fitzpatrick; 2, whether the regulations interfered with investment-backed expectations; and 3, the character of government actions. Did the regulations have an economic impact on Fitzpatrick? Yes. We met our burden of proving that Fitzpatrick was economically impacted. These facts are not even in dispute. Today you heard from Hollis Fitzpatrick and Finley Albra, who testified that even though Fitzpatrick wasn't a cash cow, the restaurant profits were steadily growing over the time, and it was a long-living business. After the regulations were implemented, there was no opportunity for Fitzpatrick to operate with a profit, and they were losing money. They even tried to change the layout of the restaurant, but that didn't help. These facts demonstrate that it was the regulation and not Fitzpatrick's business practices that caused the business to close. These regulations went too far. Did the regulation interfere with investment-backed expectations? Yes. An interference with investment-backed expectation means that the regulatory regime in existence at the time of the acquisition by Hollis Fitzpatrick will remain in place, and that new, more restrictive legislation or regulations will not be adopted. This is not what happened here, as the regulations due to the pandemic got stricter. Today you heard from Osman Hannon, who acknowledged that Hollis Fitzpatrick was indeed trying to improve the restaurant throughout the years. You also heard from Hollis himself, who confirmed that he couldn't have expected and reasonably anticipated such harsh regulations when making changes to his restaurant, which included refreshing interior design, upgrading bathrooms, installing pinball and ice cream machines, and upgrading the POS system. And the last factor under the Penn Central is the character of government actions. You heard from Hollis Fitzpatrick and Finley Ibarra, who told you about the non-uniformity of exemptions and allowance of some exceptions. Remember the movie set? And the pandemic regulations had a disparate impact on different spheres of the Buckeye community, with the restrictions being harsher on some restaurants and just in the restaurant industry in general than other businesses. Finley Ibarra testified about the inability of some small family-owned businesses like Fitzpatrick to adapt to those restrictions. You heard from Alice Mazakis, who confirmed that the same exact restrictions were applied to restaurants with different financial and spatial opportunities, and therefore hit some restaurants like Fitzpatrick more than others. Mrs. Mazakis also admitted that Hollis Fitzpatrick was initially refused an exemption, which therefore left him alone in trying to keep his restaurant alive. That, however, didn't last long. Mr. Fitzpatrick had to close his restaurant because of the restrictions toward the family and businesses were quite harsh and went too far. Even if only one factor of the Penn Central case law is present, it can be enough to constitute a partial taking. We have met our burden on all three factors: the economic impact, the interference with investment-backed expectations, and the government of character action. The restrictions implemented by the government caused Hollis to close his restaurant, Fitzpatrick's, forever. In 1922, the Supreme Court held in Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahan that governmental regulations that went too far were taken. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes stated that the general rule is that while property may be regulated to a certain extent, if regulation goes too far, it will be recognized as a taking. As Justice Holmes said, the question is when the regulations go too far, and that is the exact case here. With all three factors present of the Penn Central case, here, we request a writ of mandamus to initiate appropriation proceedings against my client. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Respondents, do you have a closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. Everything in life has a cause and effect relationship. When the COVID-19 pandemic regulations were put in place, it was the government's intention to keep everyone safe from this extremely deadly and contagious virus. While some restaurants failed to pivot into this new reality, other businesses embraced it and succeeded in this. Fitzpatrick's was one of the restaurants that unfortunately didn't adapt themselves in the best way they could and went out of business as a result. Therefore, this is not a partial regulatory taking, it's just poor decision making. Your Honors, we are here today to respond to Hollis Fitzpatrick's accusation against the government and their decisions with the COVID-19 restrictions on restaurants. The trial has summarized the facts that we already knew. Hollis Fitzpatrick was an irresponsible and stubborn individual who failed to make good decisions in a new reality when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Based off of this information, the government's decision with the COVID-19 restrictions did not take away Fitzpatrick's restaurant. Let's look at the Penn Central factors. Was the economic impact of the restrictions severe enough to constitute a taking? The answer is no. Aspen Bennett, a former waitress at Fitzpatrick's restaurant, supported his poor decision-making with the restaurant and food choices. As a result of this, he was a witness to no new customers. When Hollis Fitzpatrick filed for the PPL on October 8, 2000 and April 8, 2020, it was granted, and then later on April 30, 2020, Hollis received his first loan payment from the SBA for $125,000. However, according to the
Timekeeper, can you hear me?
I paused the time.
Thank you.
able to make enough profit due to low prices. Not to mention the addition of...
Let me interrupt you. You froze, and I don't know exactly where you froze. Could you back up 3 or 4 sentences?
Sure.
The time has been paused.
Sure. However, according to the former server, Aspen Bennett, the relief money was spent on upgrades to the restaurant itself instead of paying employees. The money that was given to the employees was cut back and they were paid from cash from the register, so it couldn't be tracked. Also, in order to draw more customers, food prices were reduced greatly. This caused the restaurant not to be able to make enough profit due to low prices. Not to mention, the addition of the pinball machines, ice cream machines, and the projector were not reliable investments to help the restaurant make money. Fitzpatrick didn't change his restaurant despite knowing it could run with a health violation. He was given multiple chances to improve his restaurant and turn a profit, but he instead ignored them. Mazakis and Bennett testified that once COVID-19 restrictions were placed, Fitzpatrick was suggested multiple ideas, such as outdoor dining for customers that would order at the restaurant, by Aspen Bennett, but he still refused to do them. He also made poor financial decisions, like spending money he did not have to try and appeal to another generation instead of improving his restaurant. He received multiple opinions ideas from Aspen Bennett and Phoenix Anderson before and during the pandemic that would have improved his business model. In short, Fitzpatrick's own bad decision-making led to the failure of any business, not by any regulations made by the state of Buckeye. The second question is, did the regulations destroy Fitzpatrick's investment-backed expectations and financial commitments? The answer here is also no. While evaluating this factor, we have to look at the regulations in the restaurant industry, and they have always been heavily regulated. As you heard from Director Mazakis, the regulations in the industry have been around since the 1980s. Fitzpatrick's history with the health department has not been perfect. The environment was unsafe and deadly for the workers at Fitzpatrick's, as you heard from Aspen Bennett. And once Hollis started investing into his restaurant again, he didn't do anything about the violation. The third question is, does the character of a governmental action weigh against finding a taking? This factor also weighs in favor of the state of Buckeye. The relator did not provide any evidence to show that this restaurant was singled out by the state. It was not only restaurants that were impacted by the COVID-19 restrictions, they were applied to bars, restaurants, salons, barbershops, and tattoo parlors. Every single one of these establishments in the state was subject to these restrictions. Finally, the purpose of government regulations was not to take away business. As you heard from Ms. Mazakis, the state made this decision for the purpose of keeping everyone in Buckeye safe. This public safety purpose weighs against the finding of a taking. In accordance with the State of New Mexico versus the real parties of interest, the public health orders cannot support a claim for regulatory taking requiring compensation. There is a 3-step test. The first step includes the authority for a state's police power, which is described as one of the most essential powers of government and one that is the least limitable. The threshold considered whether the public health orders as an exercise of the state's police power are reasonably related to the stated purpose. As a result, the orders enacted by the state of Buckeye are reasonable. Second, if that relationship is reasonable, which it was given the nature of this deadly disease, it may be determinative of insulation from a takings analysis as argued by the state. Third, the public health order's purpose does not warrant such insulation, as claims for just compensation were not determined under a fact-specific, case-intensive scrutiny as argued by the opposing side. We can conclude that the use of restrictions under the PHOs as currently constituted cannot support a claim for just compensation under Article 2, Section 20. Mr. Fitzpatrick was trying to blame the failure of his restaurant or his business on the state. However, as you have heard throughout the proceedings today, this was not a governmental taking, but rather Hollis Fitzpatrick's bad decision making.
Timekeeper, would you add 15 seconds, please? You may continue.
Thank you. I'll just restart where I was. Mr. Fitzpatrick is trying to blame the failure of his business on the state. However, as you have heard throughout the proceedings today, this was not a governmental taking, but rather Hollis Fitzpatrick's poor decision making. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the relator have a rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Thank you. So some businesses were able to accommodate to the new restrictions during the COVID pandemic, but some of them weren't. And unfortunately, Fitzpatrick was one of them who couldn't. So under the Penn Central, there are once again 3 factors. The first one is the economic impact. And Hollis Fitzpatrick was having profits within the average recommended by the government before the pandemic, and as we heard today, they were steadily increasing. That was not the case after the pandemic, as they weren't able to make the profit anymore. Also, due to the impact, interference with investment-backed expectations, when the restaurant was doing well, Fitzpatrick invested to improve his restaurant because he thought that the situation will continue going as it was in the future, and was not able to reasonably anticipate such harder restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The restrictions went too far. And lastly, there has been a disparate impact on the restaurant community of Buckeye, as some restaurants, as Ellis Mazakis admitted today, were smaller but were hit and were therefore hit harder, and this was the case with Hollis Fitzpatrick and his restaurant. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. That concludes the trial portion. I will stay on the bench for 2 minutes. Timekeeper, please start that clock now. If either team has cause to believe that there has been a significant violation of the Ohio mock trial rules, you may object within that 2-minute period. If you determine that you do not have an objection, you may tell me that prior to the 2 minutes as well.
We do not have any objections, Your Honor.
Thank you.
No objections from our side as well.
Great. Well, nice trial, everybody. Take a breath. Your day is over. I know it's been long. We are allowed 2 or 3 minutes, I believe, to give comments. I'm sure this is the least favorite part of your day, listening to me drone on, but the scoring judges probably have good comments. Would you care to proceed, Alexa?
Maybe I should unmute. Sorry. Okay. I thought you guys both did so well. I was really impressed with both sides. One point that I do have, though, which is also something that I noticed from my own experience in mock trial, was that it is okay to give in sometimes on cross. Like, I know that, like, you want to get like all your stuff in to make your side look really good, but sometimes it hinders when you like add in little comments like at the end every single time. Like, it's okay to give in. I know like it feels like you're gonna lose points if you're like, well, this is gonna make me look bad, but like sometimes it does look better that way. The objection to the expert witness, I think it was when the first team was doing the expert witness, I thought the objection was really good, and I thought the response to the objection was also great. Just overall, attorney-wise objections, I thought they were all really well, and you were also all very confident in your responses to the objections. I was very impressed with that. That's definitely a hard part of it, coming up with responses on the fly like that. Witness-wise, I thought you all knew your material really well. You all had good characters, like you're really in the character. The first witness, I thought, it really, like, there was the one point where, oh god, I forget what you said, but it, like, I kind of, like, laughed to myself. I thought, like, being in character-wise was really well. Good job, everybody.
Ashley?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My headset died, so I have to agree with a lot of what Alexa said. I really enjoyed the characters in this round. You could tell that you guys were into it, and I agree with that first witness was really good. Kind of evasive on cross, but in a good way. There were times where you could have just let them have a yes or no. You don't always have to fight them, even though I've been witness and an attorney in these competitions, and I love being a witness more. And it's hard because you want to fight them, but sometimes you don't have to. I really thought the witnesses really knew their material, and I didn't feel like anyone was really reading that much off of anything, which was nice. You guys were looking straight on, and I could understand what you're saying, and that was really good. So that's all I have.
Thank you. My comments will likewise be brief, and they are exactly the same comments that I made for the first trial. Slow down, make yourself slow down, reduce the number of words you have to say. And on witnesses, yeah, I agree. I agree. You don't have to fight on everything, but I thought there were opportunities the witnesses might have thought that they missed. And finally, Dr. Mazakas, good comeback. That was quite impressive for you to come back after having to stop. You should be proud of yourself for that. That being the end of the comments, congratulations to both teams. I hope that you have enjoyed your Ohio mock trial experience this year, and that if you're not seniors, you will continue it next year. If one of the teams proceeds, good luck to that team at regionals. So good match, guys.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you to the other team as well.